Good morning. You've probably heard by now that we are having a snow day, but there are certain things we can do to keep our class going, and one of them is this lab that was scheduled for today about data analysis and how to make graphs in Excel. This is one you can do from home, so I want you to go ahead and do that during your time off. But you'll have a week to turn this in. You are allowed to collaborate with other students. However, the paper that you turn in at the end through Brightspace does need to be your own original work. So to get started, you're going to need three files. One is this one called Schmidt-Key SP18 Data Analysis. You can find this on Brightspace in our laboratory section under Lab 1. You'll also need an Excel file with a very similar name. And you'll need this document called, it's a Word document called Lab 1 Data Analysis Worksheet. That will be most relevant at the end. So if you need to push pause and go get those things, go ahead and then resume. However, I'll go ahead and get going. So today, we have generated this lab across all of our 2107 classes because we have found that most of our students have very little experience with working with Microsoft Excel, and it's actually a super robust program for storing your data, analyzing your data, and presenting your data in a meaningful way. So we're going to go through some of the ways that you can use this, and as well as the types of graphs you can use and why they are useful for different circumstances. So a few definitions. We can divide our data into certain categories based on what they're telling us. So qualitative data is a non-numerical value. Things like gender, age, color, etc. It divides data into categories. On the flip side, we also have quantitative data, which is something that we can measure or count. And within this, we can break this down into either discrete data, which is usually counted in whole numbers, like number of influenza cases in Georgia, the number of trees, or days without rain. These are values that are not usually divided into decimals. We can't, a case of influenza is a whole case. We don't have 0.75 cases of influenza. You have it or you don't. Whereas we can also have continuous data where you could it reasonably would make sense to express that information as a fraction or a decimal. So this could include things like plant height, blood glucose levels, that sort of thing. And then we're also going to be, in most of our experiments, concerned with two variables that are called independent variables versus dependent variables. So our independent variables this is something that occurs regardless of our experiment. So whether or not we're studying something, things like time, distance, and temperature, we have very little control over that. We cannot manipulate that. What we're measuring, and the piece of data that can fluctuate in response to or as measured by that independent variable, that is called our dependent variable. So we can have a couple different ways to present data. Data is usually going to be organized in a table form, and that's what's kind of demonstrated over here on the top right of the slide. However, if these files or if these tables are really large, it can be hard to visualize any trends that may be there. And if it's a large table, it can be hard to see all of the data at once. And so graphs present a really visual representation of those tables. And you can identify trends, interpret the data, and make sense out of these numbers that may seem random at first glance. So Microsoft Excel and similar programs are a useful way to store and organize that data and then present it in a way that's useful to your audience. Now, one thing, I am doing this on a Windows machine. If you are a Mac user, I am also a Mac user, so if you have specific questions about how to do some of these things on a Mac, if you run into trouble spots, let me know. I am most familiar with the Microsoft suite, like Office, Word, Excel, on the Mac, but I know that they have companion programs too. But I can try to help, otherwise Google is your friend in this case. Okay, so types of graphs that we can use to represent our data include things like a bar graph, and within that there's also a specialty graph called the histogram. We can also use a line graph, what's called an XY scatter plot, and a pie chart. So the question that we need to be able to answer by the end of this lecture is when and why would you use each of these, and what type of data applies to each one. So we're going to go through each of these, and we're going to talk about how to generate them as we go. The first one is a bar graph. This is usually going to be used for discrete data, so that would be whole number values that can be organized into categories. Let me double check that I said that right. Yeah, that's right, whole numbers. I did say that right. Let's get back to where we were, sorry. So if we look at this here, we have our final grade values on the right-hand side from my last semester of 1001, which is a biology class for non-majors. And so this is a great example of a situation where you would want to do it. Use a bar graph for discrete data because we don't have a half of an A, we don't have a half of a B. These are whole counts. There is a certain number, a frequency of these. And so based on my table of how many F's, D's, C's, B's, and A's, we can generate this bar graph. And as you see, it forms this, in this case, forms a really nice bell curve, which is exactly what you would want for a grade distribution. So yay. But it can be used to also compare two or more things. So for example, the number of kids in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. And you can also have what's called clustered bar graphs where you'll have two of these bars right next to each other. Maybe this is number of F's in the fall, and then I could also have a red bar that comes right next to it that would be number of F's in the spring if I were also teaching 1001, if we thought that maybe there would be some meaningful difference between fall and spring semesters. So our categories are going to be shown on the x-axis, and the magnitude or the count is going to be shown on the y-axis. So this would be our independent variable. These are categories or grades that happen regardless of how my students perform. Those grade categories still exist. But the number within each one of those categories, that is our dependent variable. So this, what I just showed you actually is considered a histogram, which is a specialty bar graph. But you can also have a histogram that shows frequency distribution of continuous data in that bar graph format. And an example of this, still using the school idea, is tracking percentage points rather than letter grades. So if we were looking at their final percentage values instead of their letter grade, then we do have decimal points, and then we do have certain ranges that make sense. So we would group these data points into ranges, and these are called class intervals. And those ranges in this context would be how I divide my letter grades. So like a 70 to a 79.999 is a C, for example. In Excel, they're going to call these bins. And so we're going to hop over to Excel real quick. All of these instructions are written out here for you, but I'm going to walk you through how to do this. So if you click on your data analysis Excel file, I want you to do something for me where we go over to the white oak tab and click on that. We have continuous data here. We have decimal points. So that's a big clue that that's what you have. In order to make the histogram thing work, we have to make sure that we have what's called the data analysis tool pack. So under the data tab, you can click here and see if you have it. And I do because I use this all the time. But you may not see this here. And so I want to go over how you would get to that. First, you would push File, and you would go down to Options. That's the bottom thing. Click on that. Within here, on the far left side, under all of your options here, you're going to click on Add-ins. It's going to take a second. And I have these active because these are things I use a lot, but you might see the analysis tool pack somewhere else down here in inactive applications. It's usually standard installation with all of Microsoft's Office software. But you're going to want to select Analysis Tool Pack. You can also select the VBA one, or no, you got to only select one at a time. And that's fine. Down here, you're going to go ahead and push Go. And it's going to come up with this menu where you check the boxes for things that you want to go ahead and install, ones you don't. I don't really recall the differences between Analysis Tool Pack and the VBA version, so I always just say go ahead and add both. And that's fine. Now that you've done that, it should show up under your data tab from the top and probably somewhere over on the far right. But also look in here in case your analysis tab has been moved for some reason. Okay, so here's our data, and we have to set up what's called bins. These are something that you have to assign because Microsoft Excel cannot read your mind. So in this case, actually, hold on, let's go. Yes, this is where I wanted to go. I'm so sorry. So go over to instead of white oak, that is the problem you have to do by yourself. Instead, we're gonna go over to the practice tab, and I have exam 1 scores from an exam that I gave last semester. And this shows continuous data because again, it's possible to have half percentage points here. So we need to set up bins, and grades are a great example for us to work with because it makes sense to set up these bins. So first you have to set up those ranges, and Excel needs to know the top number of the range. So I always put, or in this case, 1 is going to equal 100%. Then the next value is going to be 0.9, or no, let's see, 899. And then we're going to have 0.799. We're going to have 0.699. And then just for the fun of it, we'll go ahead and do 0.5992. So what this is remember, these are showing the top end of the range. So eventually this is going to correspond to an A because it'll be everything from 90, which is above the top range of the next bin, to 100%. This is going to be the B range eventually. This will be the C range, the D range, and the F range. Okay, so now that we have this, we're going to go to our data analysis button here, and we'll click on that. This will probably be the hardest thing you have to do in Excel for this exercise, so it's good that we're working through this. You're going to have a scroll menu, and it's going to have a lot of different things in here, and a lot of them are going to look frightening to you until you take a statistics class, and that's okay. For today, all we need to worry about is the histogram. You'll push OK. And now you get this handy sort of work area. Now my work computer, which might be a little bit more updated than the ones that are the one that I have here, is going to have what looks like sort of a red, blue, and white icon right here. So depending on how updated your personal computer is too, you might see that, or you might see this up arrow. Either one is going to act the same way. You use this to toggle between this menu and your worksheet. So now, what did it want to know? It wants to know my input range. So we go over here, these are input values. So you highlight the scores themselves, and then you'll click back here to toggle to your menu. Then you need to select your bin range. So same thing, push the toggle button, and come over here and select your bins. You do not need to select the title bins. It's unnecessary. Okay, next thing, we need to click on output range because we want to have our data somewhere for us, and we want it to stay on this worksheet. So for that reason, we're going to push the toggle button, and we're going to just select any cell nearby. That's fine. You don't have to select the same size or anything like that, but you do want to come back here and select what's called chart output, and then push OK. Now it's going to calculate based on what you told it. Oh, I see what the problem is. We're going to repeat this real quick because these are not represented as fractions. They are represented as whole numbers. So we're going to say 89.99, 79.99, 69.99, and 59.99. Okay, so we're going to repeat that process again, which is good practice. Actually, most of the stuff will be auto-populated for you. So really, you just had to do that one quick edit, and it's going to be a lot easier this time. Okay, there we go. So in my case, I had a bunch of, I had a total of, it looks like probably about 18, because I believe that's how many kids I had at that point. Or students, not kids, you're not kids. You're fine, just leave it. Oh, there's my histogram. Look, it popped right up for me. Isn't that nice? We're gonna delete this because this was an accident. But it will show up automatically usually. If it doesn't, I'll show you how to do it in more of a manual format. But here's our histogram. And you can see that our bin values carried over, our frequency or counts moved over, and we've got some things here. You can see that this is really kind of messy and aesthetically hard to look at, but we know that these bins have actual interpretive value. So for example, I told you this is our A range, this is our B range, our C range, D range, F range. So we're gonna clean this up. And one of the ways you do that is you click on the data field in your chart, and you're going to go over here and select and move this up so we lose this more bar value that was over here because that's not meaningful. The next thing we're going to do is come select these cells over here in our bin table, and we're going to actually give those some piece of meaningful a meaningful label. So in this case A, and if you see, it auto populates over here to relabel my chart. So this is our B range, this is our C range, D range, and F range. Okay, so we've cleaned up the x-axis a bit, but some of this stuff isn't really meaningful to us. So we're gonna next talk about how to change labels, how to edit your chart. And so you click on your chart, and one of the most handy things here is going to be this plus button that you see here. So you can come in here and change this by hand and say like letter grade. You can click on this and delete it, for example. But if all of this is hard for you, you can come over here to our plus category and you can do all sorts of things. You can choose to select or get rid of axes. You can add or remove the axis titles, and there's a further menu over here to how you want to format that. You can always click on more options for more details. But if we take this away, you can see that now we have no labels on our X and Y axes. For the purposes of our exercises today, you need to have a label on all axes. Next is the chart title, that's this right here. Right now it just says histogram, which isn't very useful, but we can say where we want that to be. Maybe we want it to be at the bottom. Maybe we want it to overlay with the rest of the table. Maybe we don't want one at all, but I do. You're gonna need to have a label. You can also have data labels where it shows the actual frequency counts above your bars. That's up to you. You can show a data table. Error bars are something that's going to be more important when you get into statistics. We're not going to worry about that now. If you find that it's meaningful to show grid lines, that's up to you. And then of course the legend, this is going to be most useful if we were comparing two values. Like say I was doing comparing this exam for, oops, come on back. Let's say I was comparing bars or values for the differences between exam one, between my fall semester and my spring semester, to see if there was some difference in the way I was teaching or something like that. In that case, maybe the fall would be in blue and my spring values would be in green, for example. There's one other thing I want to mention, which is the trend line. This is going to be important for one of your graphs later on. And what it does, and not so useful with a bar graph, but it'll be important for the scatter plot. But this is useful for seeing if there's any sort of correlation. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So I mentioned that, we're going to leave this for now. I mentioned that we had, we need to, oh, leave me alone. So that's how you would get into the options area. But let's go ahead and label this as exam 1 grades. So all I did was select or click on the word chart title, and that gave me the option to fix that there. Now we're going to change these axis titles too. This is going to be frequency. It had labels initially, but I remember when I was clicking on and off to those, it got rid of them. So we're going to say letter grade down here. All right, so now if this did not auto-populate, because Microsoft sometimes acts weird and you still need to be able to generate a chart, you're going to highlight these cells and you're going to say insert chart. We're going to select the bar chart, and this clustered or this 2D clustered column, it doesn't really matter. Go ahead, that's fine. But you'll notice it looks very similar in format to what we had over here. It's a little bigger, which is not super useful or necessary. But you can edit it in much the same way as you did before. You would just go over here, you'd add axis titles, you would add a legend if that was meaningful to you. Otherwise, that's how you sort of force the issue if it doesn't automatically do it for you in Excel. Okay, let's go back to our presentation. So those directions, if you need to walk through it in more of a written format, are provided to you here in terms of how to make or get to the data analysis tool pack. And then here on the next slide is how you would generate your Excel histogram if you needed something beyond what I just went through for you. So we'll skip through that for now. That's there for your reference. Same here for your reference. Next, we're going to talk about the line graph. This is usually a way to visualize continuous data as a function of time, distance, or another independent variable. So in this case, we're talking about, maybe it could be one of the practice problems you're going to work through is oil production over time. And so that can be expressed in fractions. You can get half a gallon of oil. You can, it's a measurable number. It's not a whole count sort of thing. The data points are usually going to be connected by lines, and we can show information that's connected in some way using this. Our independent variable, such as time or distance, is going to be on the the x-axis, and our dependent variable, what's fluctuating, is going to be shown on the y-axis. We can use this to measure multiple dependent variables per independent variable too. So if we're looking at time, and we're looking at things that are happening over time, we could be measuring, for example, the number of influenza cases in the state of Georgia for 2018, but we could also be comparing that against vaccination rates for 2018 over the same period of time. And so then you would have potentially two line graphs on the same graph or two lines on the same graph that don't necessarily overlap with one another. So that can be useful in showing trends that can be useful in making predictions. Now, I did say up here that you can use this to visualize continuous data, but you can also use it to look at discontinuous or discrete data if we were talking about like number of trees or something like that too. But it's especially useful for that. So here's an example of what some of these things might look like. Here we're looking at total rainfall over time. Here we're looking at a different kind of graph. It looks like more of a logarithmic scale. It's really tiny, so it's hard for me to tell. And then here we're comparing multiple variables against time, which is our independent variable. And so for that reason, you see many different lines. The next thing I want to say, yes, over here on our data analysis Excel file is we have an opportunity to practice what we just now went over, which is the line graph. Let me make sure there isn't something else we need to talk about. No. So let's hop over to Excel. And in this case, you're going to go ahead and select the whole table. And you're going to say Insert, and we're going to do a line graph in this case. A 2D line is fine. You can also do, let's see, where'd it go? Let's see. We want to go ahead and get, so it's doing something funky right now that we're going to fix in just a second. If you notice, it's doing some funny things. You can also always click on recommended charts to see what you want to do. And sometimes this works out great because it sort of figures out what you're getting at. In this case, we want time on the x-axis, and Excel just sort of now figured that out for us. So go ahead and use that for now, but we'll also go over how to fix that. Actually, you can select that now, but I'll go ahead and show you how we would fix that if it doesn't work. So this is a good example of one that's not going to work. So we'll do that for the purposes of today so that I can show you how to troubleshoot this, because the worst thing is to be alone in your dorm room and not be able to figure this out. So first thing, click your plot area, right click, and say select data, okay? We're going to do year born, and we're going to move this to this column. Oh, whoops, nope, that didn't work. We just want this to, the horizontal category axis, there's where it is. Okay, so let me Let me get back so that I do things kind of fast once I figure stuff out, and I always forget to slow down for you guys. So when you're looking at your horizontal category axis, if we look at this, you can see it's doing this weird thing of like 1 through 11, which isn't particularly meaningful to us. So instead, we're going to say edit, and we're going to select our axis label range, and we're going to choose our years and say okay. So now let's see what happens. Perfect, great. Okay, now I deselected some information on this side over here for the y-axis or the legend entries. We're gonna go ahead and select tuberculosis, cancer, cardiovascular problems, and we're gonna deselect year born. And now let's see what happens. Perfect, looks beautiful. Okay, so there's some things we need to do here. We're not quite finished. Our data looks nice. But we need to, and our legend is here and it's useful, but we need to add some things. So for example, over here, we're going to add some axis titles. We're going to add a chart title, and your legend, if you don't like it on the bottom, you can move it by saying, I want this to be on the right-hand side, or I want this to be on the top. That's actually pretty nice. I like the one on the top. The bottom is what we've already got, but you can also mess with it in other ways. But if you want to change the colors, for example, then you would go over to more options. But we're going to leave it on the top for today. And I think we've got at least a starting point for everything. So we're going to call this, from our chart over here, it says causes of death. Based on birth cohort, by birth cohort. And what that means is everybody that was born in the same year. Cohort is a group of individuals. If we look at the axis title, what is that actually? You probably already know by now that that is the year that they were born. So we can say birth. Ooh, what did I do there? We can say birth year or year born. It's up to you. On this axis title, you highlight it and you would say frequency, or actually number of deaths. Let's say deaths. Okay, so that's done. Okay, so this chart looks pretty great now. We're pretty much done. So this would be something that you could now copy and paste this whole thing. If you select right click on the graph itself, you could go to copy, and then you could insert this into your Word document. So let's practice doing that. Copy, this is not the right section, but if we wanted to, we could say paste right here with a right click and then paste. And there it is. So that's how you would insert it into something like Word file, but you could also do this with a PowerPoint if you're comfortable with that program. So these are our practice problems. Okay, so the line graph is done. Next, let's talk about scatter plots. This is also an interesting one. We use these to visualize ordered pairs of data that can be useful for determining correlations. For example, 2 variables for each individual in the study. If we were comparing height and weight per individual, we might measure the height on the y-axis and the weight on the x-axis. But one of the things that we're going to, or one thing that I've looked at in the past with my own students, is analyzing how much time they report that they spent studying versus their exam score. And so in this case, the exam score, those values exist no matter what. So we might use that as our independent variable and x-axis, because out of 100, there's always a possibility of getting a 70%, or there's always a possibility of a 76%, etc. The dependent variable in this case is how much time they spent studying. So that's what we would measure on the y-axis. If we have enough individuals sampled, we're going to get this really interesting scatter pattern that happens on the chart, and maybe be able to draw a line of best fit to try to connect those points as best we can. And using that, we can calculate a correlation coefficient, which is actually the slope of the trend line. And the correlation coefficient is represented as a lowercase r, and it can range from -1 to 1, where 1 equals an absolute positive correlation, -1 equals an absolute negative, so 1 is absolute positive, -1 is absolute negative, and 0 means there's no correlation whatsoever. So we're going to take a look at how this one would work. So in this case, we're talking about the number, or we're looking at fish and temperature, and how it relates to the number of days that it takes for those fish eggs to hatch. So as we go up in temperature, maybe they really like being in the low temperature range. As we go up, you'll notice those numbers, both in tabular form and also in graph form, they go down. So these fish like hatching in cold water. But this is not super meaningful. If we could somehow form a trend line across this, and this actually is a very nice scatter plot for doing that, then that would help us to understand just how correlated temperature is with days to hatching. So again, we can have a perfect positive correlation where as X increases as temperature increases in the last example, then the days hatching would also increase. But that's actually not what we see. Instead, we see a strong negative on that previous slide. If you look at it again, it looks like a strong downhill, fairly tight along potential line. But a perfect positive is showing a very tight association of those data points with the line of best fit. A strong positive follows that line, but it's not exactly on the trend line that you're going to generate. A weak positive is even more loosely associated with the line of best fit. And the same is going to apply on the negative side. We can have a perfect negative, we can have a strong negative, and we can have a weak negative. The last thing is you might see a situation like this, where there's no correlation whatsoever, where you can't visually determine a line of best fit, and Excel really can't either. And so in this case, you would say, well, no, temperature of the water has no effect on the days of hatching. Now, that's not what this graph actually shows, but that's how you would interpret things if that's what you were looking at. So this is a harder one to do, so we're gonna go ahead and do that together briefly. This is allometry. This will be one of the first problems on your worksheet. So if you click on the tab for allometry in your Excel file, you're going to collect or select just the data values, not the species, not body weight versus brain weight, and you're going to say insert, and we're going to say XY scatter plot, which is this icon here. You can also click on recommended charts, and the scatter is going to be the first thing that shows up because Excel can kind of tell that these are ordered pieces of information. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm not going to select the recommended chart because sometimes it will make that really easy for you. I'm going to do it the hard way, and we're going to say, give me a scatter plot. Okay, so it looks probably the same as it would otherwise. If we look at this, we have our data points. We need to add some information here to make it meaningful to our audience. So first of all, we're going to add some axis titles, and we could add data labels, but I don't think we're going to in this case. We'll get to the trend line thing in a minute. Let's go ahead and label things for now. So we'll get rid of this. And we'll say, we can call this allometry. Whoops. Allometry is discussing the comparison between body weight and brain weight. On the y-axis, we are looking at brain weight. If you notice the units are consistent with what you see over here. So brain weight. And over here on the x-axis, we are looking at body weight. And we'll put our units in here. I didn't do that over here for brain weight, but we can add that. Whoops. Come on now. And in grams. Okay, so get rid of this. Now we have done our chart to the way that I would like you to do it. But now we need to add a trend line. So you'll click on trend line, and we're going to ask for more options. Can I just... there we go. Okay, so if you double click on the line that it generates, we do want a linear trend line in this case. The other thing I want to make sure that we do is click this bottom box here that says display R squared value on the chart. Okay, so that is done. That R squared value, remember we talked about how if our R value is between 0 and 1, then it's a positive correlation. If it's between -1 and 0, then it's a negative correlation. And if it's close to 0, then there's no correlation really at all. And we can kind of see that here. If you look at this, this is 0.09, which is pretty close to 0. It's definitely closer to 0 than it's closer to 1. So if anything, this is a very weak positive correlation. So what this means, how you interpret this piece of information, is that as you go up in body weight, there's a very weakly positive correlation that you would also expect to see an increase in brain weight. And so we can click on any of these data values if you wanted to. Which one are you? Sometimes it will. No, it's not working today. But you can sometimes, if you hover over it, that's what we're looking for. It says this is series 0.1, 73. So this would be we only have one of those. It's the whale dolphin. So as its body weight is kind of in the middle of the road, but its brain weight is also kind of middle of the road. If we look at something like hover 9.88, so that would be this one, the baboon. It's down here on the bottom where its body weight is small and its brain weight is also small. Let's look at something big. Let's talk about 184.5. That's our tiger. It is a large animal, but it does not necessarily have a big brain. It's actually kind of a small-brained creature. So this is how, again, you could sort of interpret this information. Okay, let's go back over to the scatter plot, or to the PowerPoint, excuse me, and we'll finish up. So another thing that you can work on or use to represent your data is a pie chart. And for example, there's a website you can go to calculate what your ideal learning style is. I can post that in the comments if you'd like. And for me, this is my information. I am pretty visual, auditory, tactile balanced. For example, my tactile value is 30%. My auditory value is 35%, and my visual, it's not giving me a data label, but 30 and 35 means, it's losing it now. Let's see. It's probably about 30% too. Okay, but you can use this as, it shows a percentage of all the measured categories. So altogether, this would have to equal 100%. And so this would show everything that we measured. So this could include things like number of dollars contributed per country of total UN budget, if this were an economics class or public policy class. You could also use it to demonstrate demographic data. You can use it also instead of a bar graph to display discrete or categorical data. So that concludes this information here. If you wanted to make a bar graph, or rather a pie chart, it's the same kind of process. You would go over here, you would select your data first of all, wherever it is on the chart, and then you would say pie chart, and you can choose to do a 2D chart or a 3D chart or a donut, which is kind of fun but not super informative for the kinds of things we're working on. But that's where you would access that, and you can manipulate it in much the same way as we did for our other graphs with the plus icon. So in your lab 1 data analysis worksheet, there's several problems here along with questions. So in this document, you need to embed or copy paste your chart from this document or this Excel spreadsheet over here. So you would do Control C or right click the chart and say copy. You would come over to, this isn't the right thing, but you would come over to your Word document and you would say Control V or right click paste in order to embed it in the Word document. Then you would need to answer questions. Now I want to make sure with one thing, if you are answering the question, choose a different color ink to write with. So I would say we used a bar chart or a bar graph, but do it in a different color so I can easily distinguish what your answer is versus the question. Last piece of advice, make sure you answer all the questions. You don't want to miss points because you didn't read all of your information correctly. So the data are presented a second time for a lot of these in the Word document, but it's also presented here. So the White Oak tab is here. The allometry stuff we went through, that's question 1. There's one here for crude oil production. This one is talking about student activities. Then there's another one about endangered species. And then there's one for turf perch, which is a kind of fish that, let's see, it's the last question. Is it really called turf perch? Surf perch, excuse me, but we're comparing turf versus perch. That's what it's talking about. So that's why the tab is labeled that way. So take advantage of this Excel file to answer your questions in this. This is going to be, this is what you're going to turn in, is this document here. You'll save it and then upload it to Brightspace. The due date for that, there's a folder already established for that, but the due date is going to be next Wednesday at 3:30 when our laboratory usually begins. So thank you so much. Have a great day. Be safe and warm. Goodbye.